Most of them were asleep when it happened. There was no shift underway, no crowd gathered, no bell that reached them in time. High on the moor above their beds, in the cold and the rain, an earthwork most of them had never seen and rarely thought about, finally gave way and released a lake into the darkness above their heads. There was no war, there was no earthquake, there was no act of God, whatever the newspapers of the day would try to call it. There was only a reservoir that had been built badly, known to be dangerous for years, and left unrepaired by the men who owned it. The water that came down the Holme Valley that night came because nobody had lowered a pit or mended a bank. It came because of a decision, and then another decision, and then years of quiet decisions to do nothing at all. Some 86 million gallons were let loose in a single mass. From the moment the bank broke, it took roughly a quarter of an hour to reach the mills of Holmfirth down the length of the valley. It drove water 5 feet deep into a church at Holmbridge and lifted coffins from their vaults. It carried away 4 mills, 10 dye houses, 27 cottages and 7 bridges, and more than a third of the people it killed were children. This is what it means for a community to learn, too late, what was being held above their homes. It is what it means for a body of men to be found grossly negligent by a jury of their neighbours and yet be touched by no law at all. And it reaches all the way to the present day, to a quiet rule that protects almost everyone in Britain who lives downstream of a dam. And that was written in the years after valleys like this one paid the price. To understand how an ordinary wet winter's night became the worst thing that ever happened to the Holme Valley, you have to go back, and you have to start with the valley itself. Before we go on, this channel is only just getting started, so if these forgotten corners of Victorian Britain are the kind of history you care about, take a moment to subscribe, and a like genuinely helps these stories reach more people. And leave a comment telling me where in the world you are watching from. I always love to see how far these stories travel. To understand what happened at Holmfirth, you first have to understand what the Holme Valley was and why so many people had chosen to live so close to the water. Picture a steep, narrow valley cut into the Pennine Moors with a river running fast down the middle of it. That river is the Holme, and in 1852 it was not scenery. It was the reason the valley had a livelihood at all. The Holme Valley was textile country, a cramped, hard-working stretch of woolen and cotton mills, dye houses and drying stoves, packed tight along the riverbanks, because the river was both the power and the process. The water turned the wheels, the water washed and dyed the cloth. Where the river went, the work went, and so the people went there too, building their cottages and their workshops and their mills as close to the edge of the water as the ground would allow. Holmfirth itself was a mill town of around 2,500 people, sitting where the valley begins to open out. Upstream from it, strung along the river towards the moor, were the smaller mill hamlets, Hinchliffe Mill and Holmbridge among them, clusters of stone cottages and workshops built around the mills that gave them their names. This was not a place of grand houses and open spaces. It was a place where families lived over the workshops, where the mill and the home stood a few yards apart, where a child could walk from a cottage doorway to the river in a matter of seconds. That closeness was the whole point. It was efficient. It was how a poor, industrious valley made its living from wool and cotton in the middle of the 19th century. The people of the valley were weavers and spinners, dyers and mill hands, tradesmen and shopkeepers who served them. They worked long hours in the mills and went home to cottages that were often within earshot of the machinery. They knew their neighbours because their neighbours were also the people they worked beside. In a valley this tight, a single street could hold an entire extended family, and the loss of one household could hollow out a whole community in a single night. That closeness would matter more than anyone living in it could have known. Among the families of the valley were the Hellawells, who lived at a place called Scarfold in Holmfirth, an ordinary household of a mother and father and their children, the kind of family that made up the bulk of the valley's population. There was a mill owner named Jonathan Sandford, a man of around 45, who lived with his 2 young daughters, Sarah, who was about 9, and Emily, who was about 4, and a housekeeper who ran the household. There were the Mettericks of Hinchliffe Mill, and the Crosslands, and dozens more names like them. Ordinary people whose lives were built around the mills and the river. Remember these families. They were not statistics to the people who knew them. They were the valley. And there was one more man worth naming, because his part in what happened carries a bitterness that only became clear afterward. His name was John Harpin, and he was one of the leading men behind the reservoir that sat above the valley. He had promoted its building. He had argued for it. He believed in it. And the reservoir he had championed would, in time, come back for him. Now look up. Above the working valley, high on the moor, sat 3 reservoirs, Bilberry, Holmstyes, and Boshaw Wams. They were not there for beauty, and they were not there for the towns. They existed to serve the mills. A textile mill driven by a water wheel has a simple, unforgiving problem. In a wet season, there is too much water, and in a dry season, there is not enough. And when the river runs low, the wheels slow, and the work stops and the money stops with it. The answer, the great industrial answer of the age, was to store water up on the moor in the wet months and release it steadily down the river in the dry ones, keeping the mills turning all year round. A reservoir was, in effect, a savings account of water, held high above the valley and drawn down as the mills below required. The largest and the most important of the 3, and the one that concerns us, was Bilberry Reservoir, sitting above the hamlets of Digley and Holmbridge at the head of the valley. It was a substantial thing, an embankment something like 340 feet across and around 67 feet high, holding back a body of water that had cost more than £9,000 to create. That is a great deal of money for the time, and a great deal of water to hang above a valley full of sleeping families. And the people who owned it, and were answerable for it, were not the mill hands or the villagers below. They were a body called the Holme Reservoir Commissioners. To understand the disaster, you have to understand this body, because the failure that killed 81 people was not, in the end, the failure of a wall. It was the failure of the men responsible for the wall and of a system that let them walk away. The Holme Reservoir Commissioners were not a private company in the way we would think of one today. They were a statutory body, created by an Act of Parliament, funded by the mill owners of the valley, who paid rates in exchange for the water the reservoirs stored for them. In other words, the reservoirs were built by the industry, for the industry, and governed by a corporate body that existed on paper and answered, ultimately, only to Parliament. The men who sat as commissioners were local men of standing, mill owners and their associates, the very people whose wheels the water was meant to keep turning. And that structure, that faceless, collective ownership, is not a piece of dry administrative detail. It is the hinge on which the whole tragedy turns, and it is the reason a jury of ordinary Yorkshiremen would later try and fail to hold anyone to account. The shape of it was simple: a lake above a valley, a body of men who owned that lake, and a wall of earth out of sight of the people whose lives depended on it, that those men were responsible for keeping sound. Everything came down to whether they did not, and it begins with the man they hired to build it. In 1838, the commissioners engaged an engineer named George Leather to design and oversee the reservoirs. Leather was an established figure, a civil engineer with a professional reputation, and on paper the arrangement was exactly what it should have been. A qualified engineer would design the works. The commissioners would fund and manage them. The result in principle would be a reservoir sound enough to sit above people's homes for a century. That is not what happened, and untangling why is the heart of the matter, because the failure was not one clean mistake by one clearly guilty man. It was a shared failure, spread across the engineer, the commissioners, and the years of neglect that followed, and it is worth taking the time to see how the responsibility divided, because a jury would later try to divide it too. Leather's own account, given afterward, was that the project was rushed and mismanaged by the commissioners from the start. His terms, he said, were poorly defined. He was inadequately paid, and in the early years of construction, he rarely visited the site, and by the middle of the 1840s he had effectively withdrawn from the work altogether. Now, an engineer who does not visit the works he's responsible for cannot escape blame simply by complaining that he was underpaid, and Leather does not escape it. The record is fair to him in one respect and unkind in another. It is fair in that the commissioners genuinely did rush and undercut and interfere with the work. It is unkind in that the foundations themselves, the part an engineer is most bound to get right, were laid defectively, and Leather's name is attached to them. He was not the lone villain. He was also not innocent. He was a man whose professional judgment was overridden by the men paying him, and whose reputation would be destroyed by a wall he had not properly watched being built. And the wall was wrong from the beginning. Here is the mechanism, and it is worth understanding plainly, because everything about the night of the 5th of February follows from it, and you do not need to be an engineer to see it. An earth dam is not a solid wall. It is a great bank of packed earth, and at its heart runs a core of puddled clay, a dense worked layer of clay meant to be watertight, to stop the water in the reservoir from seeping through the bank and slowly working it loose. Get that clay core right, found it properly on solid ground, and the bank will hold. Get it wrong, and the water will find its way through, and once water is moving through an earth bank, the bank is quietly dying, whatever it looks like from the outside. Bilberry's bank was got wrong. It was reported to have been built over or very near a spring, on ground that was never properly sealed, with a clay core that failed to do its one job. And the consequence showed almost at once. The dam leaked, they said, almost from the day it was built. Water found its way through and under the earthwork. The embankment settled, sinking unevenly as the water worked at its foundations, and it was never, from the first, a sound structure. The men of the valley did not need an engineer to tell them this. They could see the water coming through. For years, the people who lived below Bilberry looked up at a bank that leaked, and they were afraid of it. That fear was not idle, and it points to the second and fatal flaw. It was not only that the bank leaked, it was that the one safety feature designed to prevent exactly the kind of catastrophe that came was itself broken and was never fixed. Every reservoir of this kind needs a way for excess water to escape safely. When heavy rain fills the reservoir to the brim, the water has to be let out somewhere, and it must be let out low and controlled through a proper channel so that the level never rises high enough to threaten the top of the bank. At Bilberry, this was the job of the waste pit, the overflow, the outlet that was meant to draw water off before it could ever climb over the crest. And here is the thing that turns negligence into disaster. As the embankment settled, sinking year by year on its bad foundations, the waste pit settled with it and ended up sitting too high. It should have been lowered to keep pace, brought back down so that it could still do its work. It never was. Sit with what that means, because it was the whole disaster in the making. The reservoir now had a bank that was too weak, and a safety valve that was set too high. As the water rose, it could not escape by the safe route, because the safe route had sunk out of reach. So the water simply kept rising, up the inside of a weakened bank, towards a crest it should never have been allowed to reach. There was only one way that could end, and on the night it came, that is precisely what happened. But before the night, there were the warnings, and the warnings are the part that turns sorrow into something harder, because they were not vague and they were not few. The danger at Bilberry was not a secret discovered afterward. It was known. It was visible. It was talked about in the valley for years by the very people who would drown because of it. The leaks were the first warning, and they were constant. Anyone who walked up to the reservoir could see water escaping where no water should be. The settlement of the bank was the second, a slow, visible sinking that told plainly of a structure in trouble. Engineers and inspecting men who looked at the works raised concerns about them, and the people below did more than worry in private. In the valley, there was a settled, low fear of the thing above them, the kind of fear that a community carries for years about a danger it can see but cannot fix, because fixing it belongs to somebody else, that somebody else was the commissioners. And here responsibility narrows to its sharpest point. They had the knowledge. The dangerous state of the reservoir was not hidden from them, and it could not have been, because it was the defining fact about their single, most important asset. They knew the bank leaked. They knew it had settled. They knew, above all, that the waste pit sat too high and needed to be lowered so that the reservoir could shed its water safely. That was the repair. That was the thing that would have prevented everything that followed, and it was neither complicated nor mysterious. And it was not done. Why it was not done is the ordinary, grinding reason behind so many preventable disasters: money and the diffusion of responsibility. The commissioners were a body funded by rates from mill owners, and the reservoir's finances were troubled. Repairs cost money that a body of men, each answerable to the others, and none answerable alone, found endless reasons not to spend. It is far easier for a committee to defer a costly repair for another season than for one man to decide to leave a dangerous wall standing above his neighbour's children. Spread the responsibility across a corporate body, and the decision to do nothing becomes nobody's decision at all. The bank stayed as it was, the waste pit stayed too high, and the reservoir kept filling winter after winter, waiting for the one wet season that would fill it to the brim with no safe way out. Understand what this means about the country in 1852, because it is the larger failure sitting behind the local one. There was, in that year, no compulsory independent inspection of reservoirs anywhere in Britain. No qualified engineer was required by law to come and look at Bilberry and order it drained or repaired. No public authority held the power to force the commissioners to act. A body of private interests could build a lake above a town, watch it leak for the better part of a decade, and be under no legal obligation to anyone to make it safe. The people of the Holme Valley were protected by nothing but the goodwill and the accounting priorities of the men who owned the water above their heads. That is not a system. That is a gap, and the valley was about to fall through it. Now turn to the days before the 5th of February, because the weather was the last piece, and it did what weather does. It arrived without asking whether the bank was ready. The winter had been wet. In the days leading up to that Thursday, heavy rain had fallen across the Pennine moors, the kind of prolonged soaking rain that fills every stream and swells every river and pours off the high ground into the reservoirs below. Bilberry filled. The water climbed up the inside of its weakened bank, higher and higher, and could not get out because the safe route out was set too high to catch it. Anyone who understood the reservoir understood what that combination meant, and on the evening of the 4th of February, some of them did understand, because here is the detail that makes the night almost unbearable. It was not a bolt from a clear sky. On that last evening, as the water rose towards the crest, men gathered at the reservoir and watched it, anxious, aware that something was badly wrong. Word went down into the hamlets, and some families, the ones who took the fear seriously, began to move. They carried furniture upstairs. They gathered what they could. A few left their homes altogether and went to higher ground, choosing a cold, uncertain night away from their beds over the risk of staying. Those families, the ones who trusted their fear, are very often the ones who lived, but most did not go, and you cannot blame them for it, because this is the cruelty of a danger that has loomed for years without breaking. The bank had leaked for a decade and never burst. The fear had lived in the valley for as long as the reservoir had, and every night the reservoir had held. To leave your warm home in the middle of a winter's night, with your children asleep and your work in the morning, on the strength of a fear that had proved wrong 1,000 nights running, is a thing very few people will do. So the mill stood idle and dark for the night. The workers in their cottages and the overwhelming majority of the valley did the most ordinary thing in the world. They went to bed. The morning of the 5th of February would not come as a morning for them, but in the last hours of the 4th, the valley was simply asleep, as it had been on every wet winter night before. In the cottages of Hinchliffe Mill, in the houses along the river at Holmbridge, in Holmfirth itself, families lay in their beds with the rain on the roofs. The Hellawells were at home at Scarfold. Jonathan Sandford was at home with his 2 little girls and his housekeeper. Up and down the valley, the ordinary population of a working textile district slept within a few yards of a river that was about to become something none of them had ever seen. At the reservoir, high in the dark and the rain, the water reached the top of the defective bank, and the bank, which had been dying quietly for 10 years, began, at last, to fail. The exact behaviour of the water in those final minutes was witnessed, because there was a man whose job placed him closer to the reservoir than anyone else that night. His name was Charles Batty, and he was the drawer, the man responsible for the reservoir's works, the human being stationed at the foot of an institution's failure. He watched the water in the moments before, and as the bank went, and his description survived. There was not, he said, a great noise, but a tremendous rush of water. The regular stream, he said, was rather stronger for a few minutes, and then it came all abreast in one mass. Those were perhaps the truest words anyone spoke of that night. It came all abreast in one mass. Around 1 o'clock in the morning, the embankment of Bilberry Reservoir breached, and something like 86 million gallons of water were released into the head of the Holme Valley in a single body. Not a rising flood, creeping up inch by inch to give people time to climb. A wall of water, loosed all at once at the top of a steep, narrow valley, with the whole weight of the moor behind it, and a long run of mills, and cottages, and sleeping families below. The valley funneled it. That is the terrible geometry of the place. A wide plain might have let the water spread, and slow and thin. A narrow Pennine valley did the opposite. It gathered the flood between its steep sides, and drove it down the line of the river, gathering speed and force and debris as it went, so that what left the reservoir as water arrived in the hamlets, as water and stone and timber and the wreckage of everything it had already destroyed upstream. It struck Holmbridge first at the head of the valley. It drove into the hamlets and into St. David's Church, filling the building with water to a depth of around 5 feet, high enough to float the fittings and to lift from the vaults the coffins of the dead. Think of what that says about the force of the water alone. Water deep enough inside a stone church to raise the dead from their resting places. That was the leading edge of it, and it had not yet reached the places where most of the people were. It came next to Hinchliffe Mill, the mill hamlet strung tight along the river, where the cottages stood closest to the water and the families were most exposed. It was here, in this small cluster of homes, that the greatest concentration of loss fell. The flood took the buildings that stood in its direct path along the riverside, and it took them in the dark, with the people inside asleep, and without the minutes they would have needed to reach higher ground. A single hamlet, a handful of streets, bore a share of the 81 that was out of all proportion to its size. Whole households that had gone to bed together did not answer in the morning. The water carried machinery and boilers, and the frames of mills for extraordinary distances. A mill boiler was reported to have been torn from Hinchliffe Mill and carried down the valley and deposited near Digley Mill, an object of tons of iron moved like driftwood. Wreckage and the belongings of the drowned homes were found miles downstream, scattered along the river line towards Huddersfield. The flood did not respect the boundaries of any one village. It ran the full length of the valley, and what it did not carry it broke. From Hinchliffe Mill, the wave drove on towards Holmfirth itself, the largest of the settlements, and it reached the mill town roughly a quarter of an hour after the bank had broken high on the moor above, 15 minutes. That is the whole warning the valley had, and almost none of it reached anyone in time. 15 minutes from a bank breaking in the dark on the moor to a wall of water in the streets of a town of 2,500 sleeping people. In Holmfirth it swept through the low ground, along the river, taking mills and dye houses and cottages and shops, tearing out bridges, driving into the ground floors of houses where families slept above. The final ledger of what it destroyed reads like an inventory of the valley's whole working life. 4 mills, 10 dye houses, 3 drying stoves, 27 cottages, 7 tradesmen's houses, 7 shops, 7 bridges, 10 warehouses, 8 barns and stables. An entire economy, built up over generations along the banks of the Holme, taken apart in less than half an hour. And when the count of the dead was finally made, it came to 81. More than a third of them were children. Most of them had been asleep in their beds when the water reached their homes. That is the plain fact of it, and it does not need to be dressed. 81 people in one valley, in one night, because a bank was never mended and a pit was never lowered. Among the dead was John Harpin, and here the bitterness at the centre of it comes fully into view. Harpin had been one of the leading promoters of building Bilberry Reservoir. He had argued for the very structure whose failure now ran through the valley, and the flood, when it came, was reported to have washed his own coffin from its vault, the man who helped bring the reservoir into being carried out of his grave by the water it released. There is an irony there so complete that it needs no sharpening. It simply stands. The flood struck in darkness, and darkness shaped everything about what came next, because it meant that in the first and most desperate hours, there was no organised rescue at all. There were no emergency services in the modern sense to summon, and even had there been, the roads and bridges the valley depended on were among the first things the water destroyed. 7 bridges gone. The river crossings that would have carried help from one side of the valley to the other, swept away in the first minutes. So the rescue, in those first hours, was carried out by the only people who were there. Neighbours, survivors, people who had themselves just escaped, turning back into the wreckage and the cold to pull others out of it. They pulled people from cellars where the water had trapped them. They pulled people off rooftops where they had climbed to escape the rising flood. Some were saved by clinging to the rafters of mills as the water tore through the stories beneath them, holding on in the dark until the flood passed and hands could reach them. Among these was a man of the Metterick family of Hinchliffe Mill, who survived by clinging to the rafters as the water took the building around him, though others of the same family and hamlet were lost. The valley was full that night of small private struggles that no one recorded and no one saw, each family fighting for itself in the darkness, because there was no one else to fight for them. There is the account of Mrs. Hurst, a widow, trapped by the flood in the cellar of her own home, who was dug out by neighbours who came for her, ordinary people, clearing debris and water with their hands to reach a woman they knew. And there was a man who, from a rooftop, watched his mother and his infant sister carried away by the water below him, unable to reach them, unable to do anything but watch. It is not necessary to say more about that than that. A man on a roof in the dark, watching, and afterward carrying it for the rest of his life. The valley was full of such men by morning. By first light, the scale of it began to show itself, and it was a scale that the people who came out into the grey morning had never imagined. The valley they knew was gone. Where mills had stood there were foundations and rubble. Where bridges had crossed the river, there were gaps and torn stone. The river itself ran thick with the wreckage of the night, timber and machinery, and the furniture of 100 homes. And along its banks and for miles down the valley towards Huddersfield lay the work of recovery that the living now had to face. The dead were recovered slowly, and from a great distance. Bodies were found along the river for miles, carried far down the valley by the force of the water. Some recovered only after searching that went on for days. Some found as far as the outskirts of Huddersfield. They were brought back up the valley and laid, for want of anywhere else, in the buildings that still stood. The inns of the district became temporary mortuaries. At the George Inn in Holmfirth, the dead were laid out to be identified and claimed, and it was there that the flood's cruelty to single families showed itself most plainly. Of the bodies laid at the George Inn, a great number were of one household. The Hellawell family of Scarfold had been all but destroyed. A mother and 5 of her children were among the dead, laid together, 5 children side by side, with their mother near them. The father survived. He came as the fathers came to identify what the water had left him. That is the shape of it, and there is nothing to add to it, and nothing that should be added. A man who went to bed with a wife and children, and woke, if he had slept at all, to a valley in which almost all of them were gone. The mill owner Jonathan Sandford was among the dead, and his 2 young daughters, Sarah and Emily, with him, and the housekeeper who had run their home. Household after household in the tight streets of the valley had been reduced or erased. When a community lives as closely as the Holme Valley lived, packed family beside family along a riverbank, a flood in the night does not take individuals scattered here and there. It takes whole families at once, and it takes the neighbours who would have mourned them, and it hollows a place out in a way that a village of a few thousand feels for generations. The response of the wider country was swift because the scale of it could not be ignored. The homelessness alone was enormous. Beyond the 81 dead were the hundreds left with nothing, their homes destroyed, their workplaces destroyed, their livelihoods swept down the river along with the mills that had employed them. A whole working valley had lost, in a single night, not only its people, but the means by which its survivors lived. A public subscription was opened, and money came in, relief for a district that had been stripped of everything at once. The disaster was reported across the country, illustrated in the newspapers of the day, drawn for readers who had never seen the Holme Valley and now knew its name only because of what had happened to it. For a time, Holmfirth was the most famous ruined place in England, and then came the reckoning that should have followed, the inquest, the formal attempt by the law to find out how 81 people had been killed in their beds and to say who was responsible. This is where it turns from tragedy into something that ought to make a person angry, because the inquest did find the truth, plainly and without flinching, and then discovered that the truth was not enough. The inquest was opened on the 6th of February, the day after the flood, by the coroner for the district, a man named George Dyer. It sat at the town hall in Holmfirth, and it did not rush. It was opened and adjourned and reconvened repeatedly through the month of February, running on until the 27th, as the jury heard the evidence of what the reservoir had been and how it had failed. These were local men, a jury drawn from the district, sitting in judgment on the deaths of their own neighbours, listening to engineers and witnesses explain the leaking bank, the settled embankment, the waste pit that had been left too high, and when they had heard it all, they did not equivocate. They said exactly what they had found. They found, first, that the reservoir had been, in their words, defective in its original construction. That is the finding that fixes the fault at the root, in the building of the thing, in the bad foundations and the failed clay core. But they went further, and it is the second part of their verdict that is the heart of the matter, because it moved from the wall to the men. The commissioners, the jury found, in permitting the Bilberry Reservoir to remain in a dangerous state with the full knowledge thereof, and not lowering the waste pit, had been guilty of great and culpable negligence. Consider the precision of that, with the full knowledge thereof. The jury did not find that the commissioners had been careless, or unlucky, or ignorant of the danger. They found that the commissioners had known the reservoir was dangerous, had known the waste pit needed lowering, and had left it as it was anyway. Knowing negligence, the worst kind, and the jury named it as such, and spread the blame, as the evidence required, across the commissioners, the engineer, and the overlooker of the works, all found greatly at fault. And here comes the blow that lifts this out of the ordinary run of Victorian disasters, because the jury, having found knowing and culpable negligence in the deaths of 81 people, then had to confront what the law would let them do about it. And the answer was almost nothing. The jury recorded as part of their verdict something extraordinary. They stated that had the men responsible been in the position of a private individual or firm, their gross and culpable negligence would have justified and would have called for a verdict of manslaughter. They were convinced of it. In the ordinary case, a private man who knowingly kept a lethal danger above his neighbours' homes and let it kill them could be charged with manslaughter and made to answer for it in a criminal court. But the commissioners were not a private individual, and they were not a firm. They were a corporation, a statutory body created by Act of Parliament, and the law as it then stood offered no way to bring a charge of manslaughter against such a body. And so the jury recorded their regret, formally, on the record, that because the reservoir was managed by a corporation rather than by a private person, they were prevented from returning the verdict of manslaughter that the negligence, in their judgment, deserved. Sit with the position those 12 men were in. They had found that the deaths were caused by knowing negligence. They believed that negligence merited a charge of manslaughter, and they were told that the mere legal foreknowledge of the guilty party, the fact that it was a corporation and not a man, placed it beyond the reach of that charge. So they said so. They put their regret into the verdict itself, a jury of Yorkshiremen telling the country, in the plainest terms available to them, that the law had failed alongside the reservoir, that there was a hole in it wide enough for a body of men to kill 81 of their neighbours and walk through untouched. And walk through untouched is exactly what happened. No legal action followed the inquest. No prosecution was brought. The commissioners, a statutory corporate body answerable in practice only to Parliament, were never made to answer in a criminal court for the deaths their negligence had caused. No one was punished, no one went to prison, no one was even charged. 81 people were dead, more than a third of them children. A jury had found knowing and culpable negligence, and the consequence in law for the men responsible was nothing. The one man whose personal reckoning did come was the engineer, George Leather, though it came not as a court's judgment but as the slower verdict of professional ruin. His reputation was gravely damaged by his association with the failure. To have his name attached to a reservoir that had leaked from the day it was built and then destroyed a valley was, for a civil engineer, very close to the end of his standing. He maintained to the last that the commissioners had rushed the work and mismanaged it and underpaid him, and there was truth in that. But the inquest had spread the blame to include him, and the public did not draw fine distinctions. A dam had failed, and there was the engineer's name on it. His career did not survive it. It is a hard thing to weigh, a man whose warnings were overridden bearing a share of the ruin. But it is part of the truth of what happened, and the truth is fairer to him than his own age was. There was also government scrutiny of a kind. An inspecting officer, a government man, examined the works and delivered criticism of them that met with public approval, the beginnings of an official recognition that something in the oversight of these structures was badly wrong. But recognition is not reform, and criticism is not law. The inspecting officer could point at the failure. He could not close the gap that had allowed it. That gap, the absence of any compulsory independent inspection of reservoirs, and the absence of any way to hold a corporate owner criminally responsible for a public safety failure, remained exactly where it had been on the 4th of February. The Holme Valley had exposed it at a cost of 81 lives, and the country, having looked at it, largely looked away. That is the part that is hardest to forgive, harder even than the unlowered waste pit, because it was a choice made after the valley had already paid. The warning could not have been clearer. A defective, unregulated reservoir owned by a body beyond the reach of the criminal law had killed 81 sleeping people, and a jury had said aloud, in a formal verdict, that the law needed to change to prevent it. Everything was there. The evidence, the finding, the recommendation, the outrage. and the reckoning that should have come from it did not come. The reservoirs of Britain remained uninspected by any independent authority. The corporate owners of dangerous structures remained untouchable. The gap stayed open. Holmfirth had rung the alarm as loudly as a disaster can ring it, and Britain rolled over and went back to sleep, exactly as the valley had done on the night of the 4th. It would take 12 more years and a catastrophe several times larger before the country finally acted on what Holmfirth had already told it. That catastrophe came in 1864, and it came with a cruelty that seems almost designed, from the same kind of structure, the same kind of failure, and even the same family name. Above the city of Sheffield, some miles from the Holme Valley, but in the same broad country of Pennine reservoirs built to serve industry, stood the Dale Dyke Dam. One night in 1864, that dam failed. It released the reservoir it held into the valley of the Loxley and down towards Sheffield, and it killed around 240 people. It is remembered as the Great Sheffield Flood, and it was, in the raw arithmetic of the dead, a disaster several times larger than Holmfirth. It is its own disaster, with its own valley and its own drowned towns and its own dead, and it stands on its own and should not be folded into this one. But the two are bound together for one reason, because Sheffield was the second time the same warning was ignored, and because of a name. The engineer associated with the Dale Dyke Dam was a man called John Towlerton Leather, and John Towlerton Leather was the nephew of George Leather, the engineer of Bilberry. The same family name is attached to the first warning and to the disaster that finally forced the country to act. It is one of those facts that history occasionally produces that seems too neat to be true, and yet it is true, and it sits at the exact hinge of the reform. 12 years apart in the same reservoir country, two dams bearing the professional stamp of the same family failed and drowned the valleys below them, and it took the second and the 240 dead of Sheffield to do what the 81 dead of Holmfirth could not. Because after Sheffield, the country could no longer look away. Two great reservoir disasters in a dozen years, in the same region, killing more than 300 people between them, made the gap that Holmfirth had exposed impossible to ignore any longer. What Holmfirth had said Sheffield forced, together, the first unheeded warning and the second unignorable one, drove the long Victorian movement toward the proper regulation of the structures that impound water above people's homes. It was not a single act on a single day, and it would be false to tell you that one law sprang fully formed from the Holme Valley. It was a reckoning that built across the second half of the century out of these disasters and the public anger they generated towards a set of principles that we now take so completely for granted that we never think about them at all. Those principles are these: that a reservoir is not a private matter for the men who profit from it, but a public danger that the public has a right to see controlled. That the construction of a dam must meet proper engineering standards and not be rushed and mismanaged and founded over a spring. That such a structure must be inspected independently by a qualified engineer and not simply owned and neglected by a body that finds the repairs too expensive. And that those who impound a lake above a valley owe the people in that valley a duty of care that the law will enforce, so that knowing negligence can never again be shielded from consequence by nothing more than the corporate form of the guilty party. Every one of those principles is an answer to a specific failure at Bilberry: the bad construction, the absence of inspection, the unlowered pit left in place with full knowledge, the corporation beyond the reach of manslaughter. Holmfirth named the problems. The reform, when it finally came, answered them one by one. And here is where this reaches you, wherever you are, because what it left behind is not confined to the 19th century. If you live in Britain today, and you live downstream of a reservoir, and a great many people do without ever thinking about it, then you're protected by a regime that requires large reservoirs to be inspected, at intervals, by qualified panel engineers, professionals whose specific legal job is to look at the structure holding back that water and to certify that it is safe, or to order that it be made safe. When one of those engineers walks the crest of a dam above a town and checks the state of the bank and the working of the overflow, and writes the report that the law requires that engineer is doing, by statute and as a matter of course, the exact thing that no one was required to do at Bilberry. Lowering the waste pit, watching the bank, making somebody, by name, responsible for the safety of the people asleep below. That quiet, unremarkable rule, the routine inspection of reservoirs by qualified engineers, is one of those pieces of the modern world that protects millions of people who will never know it exists and never know what it costs to write it. It descends directly from the Victorian reckoning over disasters exactly like this one. Holmfirth was its first alarm. It was rung in the dark of the 5th of February, 1852, at a cost of 81 lives, and it was not heeded until Sheffield rang it again, louder 12 years on. But it was rung here first. The Valley paid first. The reason a stranger with a qualification and a legal duty will one day walk the top of the dam above your town and make sure it will hold begins, in part in a narrow Yorkshire valley, that learned in a single night what happens when no one does. Go up to the head of the Holme Valley, today above Holmbridge, onto the moorland where the reservoirs sit, and Bilberry is still there. It was repaired and remade after the disaster, and it holds water still, sitting near its neighbour, Digley Reservoir, in walkable moorland country that draws people out for the quiet and the air. Most who walk there now pass the reservoir without knowing what its embankment did, or that the bank they are looking at is the descendant of one that failed and took a valley with it. It is an ordinary reservoir on an ordinary moor. That is what makes it hard to look at, if you know. The thing that killed 81 people is simply a feature of the landscape now, holding its water quietly above the same valley, mended into safety by the very lessons the first version was built without. Down in the valley, in Holmfirth itself, the flood has not been allowed to become invisible. There are plaques and flood height markers in the town, around Towngate and the town centre, that record how high the water rose, physical marks on the buildings that let a person standing in the street today measure the disaster against their own height and understand in an instant what it would have meant to be there. The 1852 flood is not a forgotten thing in Holmfirth. It is a central part of the town's memory of itself, carried down through the families who lost people, commemorated on the anniversaries that matter, kept alive precisely because a place that's small does not forget the night that changed it. And at Holmbridge, St David's Church still stands, the church the flood filled to 5 feet, and whose vaults the water opened. The building came through it and remains, and the flood is woven into its story, a permanent chapter in the life of an ordinary parish church. There is even a small object that carries the whole thing in miniature, the kind of quiet relic that says more than any monument. A watermarked Bible belonging to a survivor was later given to the church by a granddaughter, a family's private keepsake of the night, stained by the flood and kept for generations, and finally placed where the story happened. A Bible marked by the water, sitting in the church the water reached. That is what a disaster leaves behind in the end, once the newspapers have moved on, and the subscriptions have been spent and the guilty have gone unpunished. A mark on a wall showing how high it came, a repaired bank on a quiet moor, and a survivor's Bible, still carrying the tide line of the worst night the valley ever knew. It is a strange thing, the way a night like that goes on living in a place long after everyone who saw it has gone. The people who survived the flood carried it with them for the rest of their lives, and some of them lived a very long time. There was a man named Alan Kay, a survivor whose recollection of the flood was set down around the turn of the century, half a century and more after the water came, an old man remembering a night from his youth that had never once left him. That is how the memory of the valley was kept in the decades before there were plaques and markers to hold it. It was kept in people, It was kept in the survivors who told it, and in the children who heard it from them, and in the families who could point to the house that was no longer there and name who had been inside it. A disaster of this kind does not end when the last body is recovered. It ends, if it ever ends, when the last person who carries it dies, and by then the marks are on the walls and the story has passed into the town itself. And what the survivors carried was not the water. It was the ordinariness of everything that came before it. That is the thing that anyone who has stood close to a sudden loss will understand. The people of the Holme Valley did not go to bed on the 4th of February, braced for catastrophe. They went to bed as they had gone to bed 1,000 nights before, with the fire banked and the doors shut and the rain on the roof, in a valley that had held for as long as they had been alive. The Hellowell children were tucked in at Scarfold. Jonathan Sandford's 2 little girls were asleep in their beds with their father in the house. The men of Hinchliffe Mill lay down in cottages a few yards from a river that had turned their wheels and washed their cloth and given their families a living for as long as anyone could remember, a river that was their friend and their livelihood and had never once, in all their lives, been their enemy. That was the last ordinary night the valley ever had that was truly innocent of what stood above it. Everyone who lived through what followed lived afterward in a valley that knew. And the knowing is the inheritance, in the end, more than the markers or the mended bank. The valley learned, in the space of a quarter of an hour, that the thing that guaranteed its living could also take everything it had, and that the men entrusted with keeping that thing safe had not kept it safe, and had known and had done nothing, and would answer to no one. That knowledge settled into the place, and never fully left it. It is in the flood-height marks that let a child measure the water against their own body. It is in the anniversaries the town still keeps. It is in the survivor's Bible in the church at Holmbridge, and in the coffins the water lifted, and in the plain, unyielding verdicts of 12 local men who found the truth and were told the truth changed nothing. The valley kept all of it. It had no choice. When 81 of your neighbours are taken from their beds in a single night, and more than a third of them are children, and the men who could have prevented it walk away without a charge to their name, you do not forget it. You cannot. It becomes part of what your valley is. For those who stayed in the valley and rebuilt on the same ground, the knowing changed something as small and as constant as the sound of rain. Rain had always been the ordinary weather of the Pennines, the thing that filled the river and turned the wheels and made the whole textile life of the place possible. After that February, a wet night was never simply a wet night again. The sound of a hard, sustained downpour on the roof, the kind that goes on for hours and does not ease, carried a meaning now that it had never carried before, and there were people in Holmfirth and Hinchliffe Mill and Holmbridge who lay awake through such nights for the rest of their lives, listening to it, doing the arithmetic they had learned the hard way, thinking of the water gathering somewhere up on the moor above them in the dark. A generation of children grew up in that valley, being told, plainly and without decoration, what had happened on the ground they played on, shown the height on the wall, given the names of the households that were gone. They inherited not just the story, but the wariness inside it, the habit of glancing up towards the high ground when the weather turned, the understanding that a thing built for their benefit and set above their heads was only ever as safe as the care that someone, somewhere, was willing to spend on it. That was the true legacy the valley carried in the years before the law caught up, before the inspections and the qualified engineers, in the long interval when the only thing standing between the people of the Holme Valley and another such night was their own memory of the last one. The valley did rebuild, because a working community with nowhere else to go has little choice but to rebuild. The mills that had been torn out were, in time, put back up. The wheels that had been carried off downstream were replaced. The trade in wool and cotton that was the whole reason for the place resumed along the same riverbank, because the river was still the power and the process, and there was no textile living to be had anywhere but beside the water. Men who had lost their workplaces in a single night went back. Once there was a workplace to go back to the same tasks in the same trade, in the same tight valley. Families who had lost their homes raised new roofs, some of them on the very footings the water had scoured. Life closed over the wound, the way life does, out of necessity rather than forgetting, and within a generation the Holme Valley was again what it had been before, a busy, cramped, hard-working stretch of mills and cottages making cloth beside a fast brown river. But it was a valley that now did its work in the shadow of what it knew, going about the ordinary business of spinning and weaving and dyeing beneath a moor that held, once more, a great body of water above its head, trusting this time that the thing had been mended and that someone was minding it, because there was nothing else the living could do but trust it and get on. The looms ran again, the dye houses steamed again, and high above them the repaired reservoir filled and emptied with the seasons, quiet and enormous, and no longer, they were assured, a danger, while the valley below turned its wool into cloth and its days into years, carrying its dead along with it in the only way a place can carry them, which is to remember, and to keep living, and to watch the sky. It is worth holding for a moment on what a number like 81 actually meant in a place the size of the Holme Valley, because it is easy to hear a figure like that and file it away as large but abstract. Break it down, and it stops being abstract very quickly. 81 dead in a scatter of hamlets, and a mill town of a couple of thousand was not a loss spread thinly across a city. It was a loss concentrated into a handful of streets, where nearly everyone who died was known by name to nearly everyone who survived. It meant places at mill benches that were not filled the following week, and were not filled for a long time after. It meant seats in the pews of the valley's chapels, and churches that stood empty, and school benches with fewer children on them, and shops that had lost both customers and keepers in the same night. It meant, in a valley where a single street could hold an extended family, that certain surnames grew suddenly rarer, that some households which had lived in the valley for generations were reduced to a lone survivor or ended entirely. Every one of the 81 had been going to do something ordinary. The next morning, a shift to work, a meal to cook, a child to wake for school, and every one of those small ordinary futures was simply cancelled in the space of the 15 minutes it took the water to come down. That is the arithmetic the living had to do over and over in the weeks that followed, as they counted who was left and measured. The gap the water had cut through the middle of their community, a gap that no subscription fund and no rebuilt mill could ever quite close. And the gap did not close cleanly, because a loss on that scale does not simply remove people and leave the rest untouched. It rearranges the lives of everyone left standing. A valley that had lost more than 80 of its own in a night was also a valley suddenly full of the newly bereaved and the newly dependent. And in a poor working district, there was no cushion under any of them but each other. There were children who had come through the water and now had no parents to go back to, and they had to be taken in somewhere, by an aunt, a grandparent, a neighbour, another household already stretched thin, absorbing a mouth it had not budgeted for. There were widows left without the wage that had kept a roof over them, and older people who had depended on a son or a daughter now gone, and injured survivors who could not immediately return to the benches and looms that were their only means of living. In a community woven as tightly as this one, where the man at the next loom was as likely as not a cousin or a brother-in-law, every death sent its weight outward through a web of obligation and affection, so that the true cost of the flood was never just the 81 who were counted, but the far larger number whose lives were bent permanently around their absence. The relief that came from the rest of the country helped with the immediate ruin, the lost homes and the lost tools of a trade, but it could do nothing about that quieter, longer reckoning. The years in which a valley quietly carried its orphans and its widows and its broken households and made room for them. One adjusted life at a time, because there was no one else to do it and nowhere else for them to go. To understand quite how exposed the Holme Valley had been, it helps to see that Bilberry was not a freak, not a single strange danger set above a single unlucky place. It was one instance of something the industrial north had been doing on a large scale for decades. Across the Pennines, wherever fast rivers had drawn the mills to them, the same logic that built Bilberry had built dozens of others. Reservoirs thrown up on the high moorland to bank water for the dry months. Earthworks of packed soil and clay holding back millions of gallons above the very valleys whose industry they served. It was, in its way, one of the quiet engineering marvels of the age, this reshaping of the uplands into a system of artificial lakes that kept the wheels of a whole region turning. But it was a marvel built at speed, driven by the appetite of industry for a steady supply of power, and it was built almost entirely without the independent oversight that such structures demanded. What that meant, though almost no one living below them chose to dwell on it, was that a great many working communities across the textile districts were in precisely the position the Holme Valley had been in, going about their lives beneath a man-made lake whose safety depended entirely on how well it had been built and how faithfully it was maintained by men they would never meet, according to standards that no law required anyone to check. Holmfirth was simply the valley where the risk that so many of them were unknowingly carrying finally came due. It was the place where the general danger of the age became, for one night, a specific and unanswerable fact, and where the rest of that reservoir-building country was given, if it cared to look, a plain demonstration of what its own quiet appetite for stored water had placed above the heads of the people who worked beneath it. There is a particular kind of danger that human institutions are almost designed to ignore, and the reservoirs of that age were a textbook example of it. It is the danger that arrives slowly. A sudden hazard forces a decision, a fire, a collapse, a machine that maims a worker on the first day. All of these demand an immediate answer, and usually get one. But a bank that leaks a little more each year, that settles by inches, that gives its warning not in a single alarming moment, but in a long, gradual, entirely survivable deterioration, is the very hardest kind of danger for a committee to act on, precisely because it never quite forces the issue. Every year, it looks much as it looked the year before. Every year, the reservoir holds, as it held last year, and the year before that, and the cost of the repair is real and immediate, while the catastrophe it would prevent remains hypothetical and apparently indefinitely postponable. So the repair waits. It waits not because anyone decides the danger is acceptable, but because no single moment ever arrives at which not repairing feels like the reckless choice it actually is. The slow danger lets everyone off the hook, right up until the night it does not, and then the whole decade of small postponements arrives at once, in the dark, with the full weight of the water behind it. That was the trap the Holme Valley fell into, and it was a trap laid not by malice but by the ordinary human preference for the cost that can be deferred over the cost that must be paid today, a preference that is harmless in 1,000 small matters and lethal in the one matter that happens to be holding a lake above a sleeping town. What the survivors of such a night are left to reckon with, often for the rest of their lives, is how thin and how arbitrary the line was between those the water took and those it spared. It was not, in the main, a line drawn by courage or by warning or by any choice a person could be proud of having made. It was drawn by chance, by the accident of where a bed happened to stand. To sleep in an upstairs room rather than a ground floor one, on the night the water came in the dark, could be the whole difference between living and not. To live a little higher up the valley side, a few yards back from the river's edge, rather than in the row of cottages built closest to the water, because that was the cheapest ground, could be the difference. To have been wakeful, or a light sleeper, or roused by a neighbour's shout a few seconds sooner, could be the difference. None of it was earned. A family that survived and a family that did not might have been near neighbours, living the same lives, facing the same danger, separated by nothing more than the geometry of where the flood happened to strike hardest and how many seconds each of them had. That is a bitter thing for a survivor to carry, the knowledge that they are alive not because they did anything right, but because the water, for reasons that have nothing to do with justice, ran one way and not another. And it deepened rather than eased the strange communal weight the valley carried afterward, the sense of a whole community that had passed together through a single night and come out of it sorted without rhyme or reason into the living and the lost. It is worth pausing too on the strange new fact that a disaster in a remote Pennine valley could become, within days, a picture in front of the whole country. This was an age just learning what it meant to see catastrophe at a distance. Artists and correspondents made their way up into the Holme Valley in the aftermath, and the illustrated press of the day carried engravings of the wreckage to readers in London and across the country who had never heard of Holmfirth before that week and would very likely never go there. They saw the shattered mills rendered in careful lines, the broken bridges, the choked and ruined river, the scale of the destruction laid out for them on the page. For a working valley that had lived in obscurity, going quietly about the business of turning wool into cloth, it was a peculiar and terrible kind of fame, to be known to the entire nation, not for anything it had made or done, but for the single night it had been destroyed. And there was a real power in those images because they made the disaster undeniable and vivid to people who would otherwise have read a paragraph and turned the page. They helped drive the sympathy that filled the relief fund, and they fixed the name of the place in the national memory. But an engraving of a ruined mill, however moving, could carry only so much. It could show a country what the water had done to a valley's buildings. It could not by itself make that country change the law that had let the water loose. And for all the attention the pictures drew, the deeper lesson beneath the rubble they depicted was one the nation would look at and be moved by and then set aside. Among those who tried to make sense of it in the immediate aftermath were the ministers of the valley's chapels, and it is worth remembering how a deeply religious working community would have reached for meaning in the days after such a loss. One contemporary account of the flood was set down by a Wesleyan minister and given the title Sorrow on the Land, an attempt to record what had happened while it was still raw and to hold it up for the reflection of the living. In a valley thick with Methodist and other nonconformist chapels, the pulpits in the weeks that followed would have been the place where the bereaved gathered to look for consolation, and the temptation, the very old temptation, was to fold the disaster into the language of providence, to speak of the hand of God and the mystery of his will, to make the flood a visitation to be endured rather than a failure to be answered for. And there is a real human comfort in that, for people standing at the graves of their children with no power to have prevented what took them, but it sat uneasily beside what everyone in the valley plainly knew, which was that this water had not come from the hand of God at all. It had come from a bank that men had built badly, and men had failed to mend, and the valley knew the names of those men, and knew the repair that had gone undone. So the accounts that survived from those first weeks carry a certain tension in them, between the language of heaven that a grieving Christian community reached for by instinct, and the hard earthly truth that pressed up underneath it, the truth that this was a thing that need not have happened, that a lake let loose on a sleeping valley was not a mystery of divine purpose but the entirely explicable result of a decade of human choices. It is a tension that runs through much of how the age spoke of its disasters, and Holmfirth sits squarely inside it, a catastrophe that the faithful were moved to call providence, and that the facts insisted on calling negligence. And when the language of the pulpit had been spoken and the relief had begun to arrive, there remained the plainest and oldest task of all, which was to bury the dead, and in a valley that had lost so many at once even, that was a labour out of all ordinary proportion. Funerals in a small community are usually singular things, a whole village turning out for one coffin, one grave, one family's grief, given the full attention of everyone who knew them. Here that was impossible. The dead came in numbers. The valley's churchyards had never had to receive together, and the burials went on across days, procession after procession, up to the same few grounds. The same clergyman reading the same words over grave after grave, until the words themselves must have worn smooth. There were households buried all but entire, coffins of different sizes carried out together because they belonged to a single family, the largest and the smallest side by side. The whole valley became, for a period, a place of near continuous mourning, its ordinary rhythms suspended, its people moving between the wreckage they were clearing by day and the graves they were filling in the churchyards, trying to give to each of the dead the dignity of a proper Christian burial, even as the sheer number of them threatened to reduce the whole thing to grim routine. It is one of the quiet cruelties of a mass disaster that it strips grief of the space it needs, that it forces the bereaved to bury one loved one, while others are still being searched for downstream, that it turns the most personal loss a person can suffer into one small part of a communal catastrophe too large to take in. The Holme Valley did what such places do. It buried its dead as well, and as decently as it could, in numbers no valley should ever have to. And then it turned, because it had no choice, back to the enormous work of going on. That going on did not erase the flood from the families who lived it. And one of the quietly remarkable things about a disaster like this is how long it stays alive inside the private memory of a place, passing down through the generations of a family as something more intimate than history. There are people in and around Holmfirth today who can trace their own line directly back to that night, who know that a great-great-grandparent came through the water, or did not, and who carry the flood not as a fact learned from a book, but as a piece of who their family is. In a valley where the same surnames have persisted for generations, the disaster is woven into countless family stories, the ancestor who survived by chance, and so made all the descendants who followed possible, the branch of a family that ended in the water and is remembered as the line that might have been. That is a kind of remembrance no plaque can manufacture and no anniversary can replace. The flood held in living families as part of their own origin, told at kitchen tables, attached to a name in a family tree, kept alive because it is not somebody else's tragedy, but their own. It is why a place like this does not need to be reminded of what happened to it. The memory is not a civic duty there. It is a family inheritance, handed down the way such things are, so that a child growing up in the valley may learn the story of the flood. Not first from a teacher or a marker, but from a grandparent explaining exactly where they fit into it, and why the whole family is here at all. And because the memory lives in families, it has also been kept patiently and with real care by the local historians who make it their work to get such a story right. Every place that has suffered something like this tends to produce, in time, the people who become its keepers, who gather the old newspaper reports and the parish records and the handed-down recollections, who walk the ground and match the accounts to the actual streets and buildings, who correct the errors that creep into a story as it is retold across a century and a half and set down, as accurately as the evidence allows, who lived where, who was lost, and how it truly happened. It is unglamorous work, done largely for love of a place and its past, and it is the reason a disaster from 1852 can still be told today, with names and details attached rather than dissolving into a vague folk memory of a flood that once came down the valley. That careful local remembering matters more than it might seem, because the natural fate of an old tragedy is to soften into legend, to lose its specifics, to become a story about water and loss, with the hard facts worn away. The keepers of the Holmfirth flood have refused to let that happen. They have held on to the particulars, the date and the hour, the height the water reached, the households that were destroyed, the exact nature of the failure that caused it, so that the 81 are not remembered as a round and faceless number, but as what they were, real people from real houses on real streets, and so that the lesson buried in their deaths stays legible to anyone willing to go and learn it. It is a form of respect, that insistence on accuracy, and it is perhaps the truest one available to the living, to refuse to let the dead blur. There is a reason a story like this keeps its force long after the particular valley has healed, and it is that the failure at its heart was never really about one bank on one moor in one Yorkshire valley. It was about a pattern of human behaviour that does not belong to the 1850s at all. Everywhere in the world where people live below something large that was built to serve them, a dam, an embankment, an ageing structure holding back a weight it was designed to hold, the same quiet question sits underneath their safety, which is whether someone is genuinely watching it and repairing it and treating a slow and undramatic danger with the seriousness it deserves before rather than after it fails. The specifics change. The reservoirs of the industrial Pennines have their equivalents in every age and every country, and the temptations that doomed the Holme Valley to defer the costly repair, to let responsibility diffuse until it belongs to no one, to trust that a thing which has held so far will go on holding, are not Victorian failings that we have outgrown. They are permanent features of how institutions behave, and they have to be guarded against permanently, by rules and inspections and named responsibility, precisely because the instinct to postpone never goes away. That is why Holmfirth is worth knowing far beyond the boundaries of the valley it destroyed. It is not a closed chapter of a distant century. It is a clear, early, fully documented example of a kind of failure that remains entirely possible wherever vigilance lapses. A reminder set down in stone and record that the price of neglecting the slow dangers is not paid gradually, in instalments, but all at once, by the people who happen to be asleep beneath them on the night the neglect finally comes due. There is one more strand worth drawing out of that inquest, because the jury of the Holme Valley, in their frustration, had put their finger on a problem far larger than a single reservoir, one that the law would wrestle with for generations after them. They had said, in effect, that a body of men acting together as a corporation could do a thing that would send a single man to answer a charge of manslaughter, and yet escape that charge entirely, purely because of the form they had taken. That is not a small observation. It is one of the central difficulties of the whole modern age, in which so much of what is built and owned and run above and around ordinary people's lives is owned not by individuals who can be held to account, but by corporate bodies, companies, and commissions and boards in which responsibility is genuinely shared and therefore genuinely diffuse. The question those 12 Yorkshiremen asked, of how you hold a collective entity criminally responsible when its negligence kills, was ahead of its time, and the honest truth is that it was not properly answered for a very long time indeed. The gap they identified, the way a corporate form could stand between grave negligence and criminal consequence, would remain a live and difficult matter in the law for well over a century, argued over and slowly narrowed long after everyone connected to Bilberry was dead. So their verdict was not only a finding about one flood, it was an early, plain-spoken statement of a problem the modern world was only beginning to encounter, delivered by ordinary men who had been forced to confront it at the graveside of their own neighbours, and who had the clarity to name exactly what was wrong, even though they had no power to fix it.